Freeman by Clare London. I don't know how the hell he ended up sitting next to me. I sat in my usual place, out of the way. Clubs weren't really my thing, but after the pubs closed, they were the only places I could get some company with my drinking. Not that I wanted some one-to-one, not even a conversation. Just company in the background. Noise, babble, bodies. I don't know what people would call me. Observer, not participant. Antisocial, maybe? Bar brand had an ugly name that made me wince, and an equally ugly, dark decor that reflected more the patron's need for discretion and a swift, nameless hookup than for stylish interior decoration. But then I wasn't there for the trimmings either. It was just somewhere to be. The young man landed himself on the bench seat beside me abruptly, an invasion of gangly limbs and impatient breath, with his dark hair falling over his face, nearly as tall as I was, but very thin. Younger too by several years. It was unusual to see that kind of energy and enthusiasm in someone who had left his teenage years behind him, especially not in a dive like this. A fine advertisement for the dangers of drink, drugs, and economic drudgery. Got a light? It was a familiar pickup line, and I should have announced that despite Bar Brand's lurid advertising, I wasn't here for that. But it was the end of the night, and I'd worn out my discouraging grimace on other approaches some hours since. Besides, he clutched the spliff and looked like he genuinely needed a light. Silently, I offered him my matches. He lit the joint and took a long, grateful draw. I sat in one of the darker corners of an already murky club and watched the ring of burning tobacco light up his angular face for a second or two. Young, yes, but enthusiastic, no. His eyes were bright, but artificially so. The lines around his mouth were deeper than they should have been at that age. Perhaps he saw me looking at him, because he grinned back. It made him look younger again, and very striking. Want some? We shared the joint for a while. He seemed settled there, and I didn't feel inclined to move him on. When I passed it back over to him each time, he took hold of my wrist to steady himself. It wasn't a come-on, but a natural touch. He gradually relaxed, but his eyes were still alert, continuously darting over the bar and the tablecloth-sized dance floor. Most of the tables were empty by now, a half hour or so before closing time. The pipe music throbbed in the background with an indistinguishable techno track. The barman in vinyl shorts that were uncomfortably tight around his thighs wiped the plastic top tables, yawning occasionally. My visitor was watching for a particular man, who I knew was still around. Of course, I knew many people there, even if they didn't or didn't choose to acknowledge me. "I'm with George, you know." I didn't answer him. He probably guessed I'd know who he meant. It was no surprise, but it wasn't any business of mine, and I didn't intend to make it so. To each his own. "He's okay," the young man chatted on as if I'd asked him to. His voice was quite deep for his age. Now that he'd relaxed, his movements were less coltish, more graceful. Just past the ungainly teenage years, when the limbs move faster than intention, and just before the more solid assurance of the late 20s, when adult inhibition takes control of the reins. He was good to look at. I admired the way he was so careless of his body, and yet so artlessly sensual. I was jealous, maybe. I smiled to myself, surprised at the thought. He gestured vaguely towards the bar. "Been here in the city a few months. He's looked after me, got me a job, shown me the ropes. You know how things are with him." This question was rhetorical, and we both knew it. My answer would have been yes, though probably not for the same reasons. There'd been plenty of young men like him. That was one of George's hobbies, as was common knowledge. George Marshall owned this club, at least he did the last time I'd been here, and probably plenty more by now. And other businesses in this part of London where the nouveau rich and the commercially shrewd made territory of their own in the last few years. This particular club sat on the outskirts of an ambiguous area in the city, where new money mingled with old hardship, and the mix of ethnic cultures and confused moral codes was a tinderbox at times. But it was also an area that was vibrant and volatile and fascinating, both to those who rode the changes and those who watched. Observers like me, I guess. A place where the aggression and resentment could breed both opportunity and opportunism. George had always been good at taking advantage of that. He employed a lot of transient workers in these businesses. Ever astute, he tapped into the attraction of this area for young men passing through, seeking their ever-elusive fortunes, or just looking to hide with the maelstrom of everybody else's life. Near enough the centre of the capital, yet easier for transport and cheap lodgings, an area accessible to men who slipped through the cracks of the tax system and governmental bureaucracy, yet needed enough money to live on and to find some entertainment. And some of them caught his eye as playthings as well. I watched a couple of drunken club members weaving their way across the beer-soaked carpet towards the exit, arms around each other's torsos, on their way to find another place to tryst. I could only hope for their sakes it was more salubrious. On the seat beside me, my visitor turned directly to me and stared. It startled me. His hand waved the last dregs of the joint at a point in the unidentified distance. His look was stark. "Anyway, you got anything else? I've got money. Some." I stared back into rich brown pools of frightened awareness. It was like all his humanity had parked up in his eyes, leaving the rest of his body a shell that drove on automatic under the buzzing neon lights. He was very attractive in a pale, gamin kind of way. He was no girl, I gave him that. But he had vulnerability that seemed to have soaked right through him to the core. Not just the look that was put on with low-slung jeans and a fashionably tight black t-shirt. "I don't have anything," I said, which was true. He dropped his scrutiny, his gaze shifting away. Then he laughed, softly and wearily. "Maybe I don't have the money either."